Background music is a pretty niche topic. As someone who's centered much of my content and career path around its creation, I understand all too well that most media consumers simply don't care or pay attention to the music accompanying whatever it is they're consuming unless it's integral to whatever the main focus is. And in the case of anime, you can see this in just about every MyAnimeList review when they get to the sound portion. 90% of the time they'll only talk about the voice acting, 5% of the time they'll also include the opening or ending, and the last 5% will say something about the actual soundtrack. Of those final 5%, maybe 1% actually says something more substantial than, "It's fine." I don't think the average anime watcher is unaware of why music is important in their favorite shows, but rather that their lack of knowledge on the subject makes them feel unqualified to comment on it further. I mean, as if commenting on any other aspect is something they're qualified for. It's strange then that somehow the presence of lyrics, in a language 99% of them don't understand, allows for people to comment on the singer, but take away the face of a piece of music and suddenly everyone's shy. So let's pick up where everyone else dropped out and talk about the one thing MAL reviewers are too timid to touch. It's no secret that nearly every English-speaking anime fan has seen Cowboy Bebop and universally praises its opening. I haven't actually checked, but I'm sure that a quick search will reveal at least a few reviews of the opening tank, so I'm actually going to do something a bit controversial for this video and skip over it. That said, let's start with something in the same vein. I would argue that after Cowboy Bebop, Baccano has the next most well-known instrumental opening within the anime community. I don't have any actual data to back that up, but considering I've never heard anyone mention or reference any of the other three I'm going to talk about, it's probably a pretty safe assumption to make. That and this track is so good, I'm actually surprised it isn't regarded better than Tank. Guns N' Roses is high energy and a lot of fun, indicative of the hijinks that ensue on the crazy train ride through the 1930s USA. Given the setting and storyline, this wild big band style track by all-female jazz group Paradise Lunch is amazingly fitting for a story about mafia groups, scientists, hitmen, alchemists, and whatever Isaac and Miria are supposed to be getting into trouble aboard the Flying Pussyfoot. No, I will never get used to saying the train's name, and I doubt you will either. The track weaves around different instruments, allowing most of them to take the lead either in a solo or duet, much like how the many characters each have their own narratives that weave in and out of focus within the overarching narrative of the show. First, we open with a trumpet and alto sax playing in tandem, leading into a funky bass line and steady rock drum beat before coming in with the A section, a duet between the alto and tenor sax supplemented by trumpet blasts. The tenor sax then gets its chance in the spotlight as it takes over the leading melody for the rest of the piece, at least as far as the anime opening version is concerned. It serves as a leading line that we can follow as the other instruments punch in and out of the musical space. The electric guitar also follows it quietly from behind, as if to give us another focal point on the single line we've been following without stealing too much attention away from that one. Unfortunately, the anime opening version has to be cut short, which means missing out on a killer baritone sax solo and trumpet duet from the full version of the track. Being perfectly honest, I don't have the jazz theory knowledge or inherent coolness to break down most of what's going on beyond the fact that this is inarguably a super fun piece of music. It perfectly manages to capture both the chaos and wackiness that occurs across the anime's runtime while still maintaining the coherence of a regular narrative, and it all fits perfectly within the American 1930s setting it's been placed in. It might not be your cup of tea if jazz and big band aren't really your thing, but whenever it comes up in one of my playlists, Baccano's opening is one that I'm always glad to listen to. If you've never heard of Ghost Hunt or simply forgot about its existence, I don't blame you because honestly it isn't a show that I would have remembered if not for the fact that both the opening and ending were instrumental. Not only is it pretty rare for one of the two to be instrumental, but I don't know if I can think of any other anime where neither is a song of some sort, a song being something that can be sung. Not only that, but the composer, Masuda Toshio, is the only music staff listed for the entire show as a whole. It isn't super uncommon for a show's background music composer to also compose the opening or ending for the show, but because there was no songwriting to be done and thus no further music outsourcing, Masuda is one of the only composers I can think of who is in charge of writing all the music for the entire anime project. That said, the opening itself is, put simply, not particularly impressive as an opening, though it does work perfectly fine for the show it was made for. Through the use of unresolving bass harmonies, unnerving minor second and third intervals, and simple minor triad runs, the music captures the classic spooky vibes of an old horror film, which, in fairness, is what it's supposed to be, just in TV anime format. Quick staccato melodies backed by ghostly vocals are a surefire way to cause a few chills, and while incredibly cheesy, almost to the point of ruining the effect out of pure campiness, the xylophone doubling the string melody conjures images of skeletons doing some kind of dance. Perhaps a spooky, scary skeleton dance.
Spooky, scary skeletons.
There's also this really cool breakdown section in the middle where the quick staccato runs cut out, replaced with a slow rising legato line and bass drones. It only lasts 4 bars, but it's a chance to breathe amongst the sharp dissonances and onslaught of flighty high tones. The warmth of this very brief section serves as a chance to see a light at the end of the tunnel, mirroring how the protagonists often find themselves in a dire situation with no apparent solution, only to have a moment of clarity supply them with the answer for exorcising the spirit coming after them. It then returns to the quick runs and even adds in the classic horror sound of the water phone as the piece crescendos its way towards the end. So why did I say it wasn't interesting as an opening? Well, basically it comes down to the appeal of the track against the rest of the show and soundtrack itself. Openings are meant to get you excited, or at least curious about what you're about to watch, and often a song with lyrics is all it really takes to draw someone in, as the voice is something you can latch onto even if you don't understand the language. Without any words though, the melody needs to be strong enough to keep you interested, and in the case of Ghost Hunt, well, there isn't really a continuous melody to speak of. It's basically just a bunch of flighty musical lines that move up and down, but nothing about it differentiates the track itself from a piece of standard background music. It sounds fine, and it certainly captures the essence of the show, but it does nothing to add to the anime or soundtrack in any significant way. If the rest of the soundtrack hadn't sounded as good as it was, perhaps the opening and ending may have stood out as some of the best, but because the show itself wasn't anything worth remembering and the music was already quite good, the opening being equally as good as the rest of the soundtrack actually makes it feel quite lackluster by comparison. To contrast the previous example, the opening for Gokukoku no Brynhildr in the Darkness, is hype from start to finish and leaves a sense of excitement that carries into the show. The show itself, much like Ghost Hunt, is nothing to write home about, but the opening never fails to be a highlight in the darkness that is Brynhildr. See what I did there? Brynhildr's Darkness? Because the title? Brynhildr in the Darkness? If you asked me to recall what this show was about from memory, I would tell you something like alien, witch, possibly robot harem for unimpressive dude in an observatory where they fight evil things and there might have been a meteorite or virus or something. Basically, I remember nothing about the show, but if you were to ask me about the music, I would immediately point you towards the opening, which kept me coming back even when the show itself was nothing worth talking about. Like Ghost Hunt, the show's composer, Tokisawa Nao, wrote the opening as well as the rest of the OST, but where Masuda was unable to make Ghost Hunt's opening capture both the essence of the anime and an opening song, Tokisawa had no problem whatsoever making sure the opening would stand out amongst the rest of the show's soundtrack. Electronic music isn't necessarily a rarity for anime openings and endings, but it definitely isn't common, especially not in this style. I won't pretend I know the specifics of electronic production, or whether this is melodic dubstep or some kind of weird 2014-era new prog house variant, but from a compositional perspective it's all very well made. The strings are used in place of a lyrical vocal line, and thus we have a clear melody to follow along to, allowing our brains to latch onto a part of the track and use the beat to carry us along at a steady pace. Before the strings get too repetitive, however, the drums change their rhythm and a vocalist is added into the mix, chanting out a ghostly counterline that we subconsciously latch onto because of the repetitive string melody and, well, simply because voices are what we are instinctively drawn towards. In this way, the voice carries us through the slow breakdown where the strings drop out, allowing the intense and sudden change in sound to feel smooth. The closing section changes up the string melody into descending runs and even fakes a key change right near the end, pulling us in for one final moment before closing out the track. Unfortunately, I can't actually speak to how well the opening fits the anime because, as I mentioned before, I remember basically nothing about the show. But simply by looking at the visuals the track accompanies and piecing together what few memories I have of it, the opening manages to capture both the dark atmosphere of the show as well as the action and sci-fi elements involving the girls fighting something. The electronic beat and bass line set the semi-futuristic stage in which our otherwise modern-day story takes place, and the strings and vocals add a sense of operatic drama to it. The darker harmonies and glitchy electronics create a sense of urgency and intensity, and all these parts culminating together gets the listener excited for what they're about to experience. For the last example, Akatsuki no Yona, Yona of the Dawn, has what I consider to be the next most memorable instrumental opening after Baccano's. This is partially my own bias because it's an orchestral opening, but overall this is also a fantastic anime with an incredible soundtrack. I also can't think of many other instrumental openings or even a lot of regular openings that I've found to be as powerful as this one. Akatsuki no Yona's titular opening theme also serves as both the show's main theme as well as the overture for the series as a whole. The 90-second version begins with a drone and a drum pattern slowly increasing in volume. This is built upon with some sort of metallic percussive instrument, possibly muted crotales if not a more ethnic Korean instrument. As the pattern swells to a pause, we get an epic string and woodwind entrance forming into a traditional East Asian pentatonic melody. What this tells us right away is that A, this series is about war or battles, as referenced by the drums and quick-running strings and woodwind patterns, and B, this series is set in East Asia, most likely during a feudal period or some sort of fantasy equivalent. From what I understand, Yona's setting is either in a fantasy equivalent of feudal China or Korea, though given many of the characters' names, the choice to record with a Korean orchestra, and my general lack of knowledge of Korean history and culture entirely, I'm more inclined to believe it is Korean-inspired than Chinese. Regardless, these two facts are established very quickly, followed by a solo on a bamboo flute, which we can assume represents Yona and her journey to find the 4 dragons so that she can retake her kingdom. The quick flighty string melodies that take over are more representative of Yona and Huck fleeing the capital, while also being a subtle hint towards the romance between the two of them. This romantic implication, however, is never brought to the forefront, as the overture and story are much more focused on Yona's transformation from a sheltered princess into the powerful protagonist set on repatriating her homeland. What I find so impressive about Akatsuki no Yona's opening is that it manages to capture so many of these elements in only 90 seconds and without any words to simply tell us outright. Music is a language of interpretation, and the reason we are drawn to the voice is because even if we can't understand the language, it is the most direct means of communication, disregarding body language, and much can be gleaned from intonation alone. By forcing the listener to interpret abstract sounds, we reach our own understanding of how the music connects the story to us, which makes the takeaway that much more personal and enriching, assuming of course that we actually take something away from it. This of course also applies to all the instrumental openings, but Akatsuki no Yona's is on a level of its own. At the time of recording, I've only seen each one of these shows once, and how much I remember each one varies. What this video was for was not necessarily to explore why each instrumental opening is good, but rather how much power and sway they have over the show they were written for as a result of not having lyrics. With a regular J-pop or light rock song, you can sort of treat it as a separate entity from the show, meaning that it doesn't usually have as much sway over the anime outside of recognition and association. And so I've compiled this list to explain how well each track works as an opening for the show it was written for. Catchiness pertains to how well you can jam along when you hear it, and is mostly subjective to the listener's taste in music. Memorability is like catchiness but without hearing it. It's less subjective than catchiness since you need to be able to remember it yourself, but you don't necessarily need to enjoy it. Setting the tone is just about how fitting the piece is for the show it's made for. The anticipation factor asks, does it make you excited or intrigued to watch what comes after? And musical intrigue answers the question, is it an interesting standalone track? This one varies in subjectiveness because it encompasses enjoyability as well as compositional technique. Based on these criteria, here are the results. Baccano's opening is super catchy and super memorable, so it gets a 5 in both of those categories. It fits the setting of wacky hijinks in 1930s America and sounds just like the rest of the soundtrack despite being the only opening of these 4 not written by the show's composer. I'll give it a 4 if only because it hides some of the darker elements of the show beneath the silliness of it all. It gets me hyped to watch the show as a whole, so it gets a 5 there, and I've listened to it more times than I can count, so as far as musical intrigue is concerned, it's also a 5. Ghost Hunt's opening isn't all that catchy, mostly because it doesn't have a melody to latch onto, so it gets a 1 there. It gets a 2.5 for memorability because I can remember it once I've heard the first few seconds of it, but subjectively that could just be me. It gets a 5 for capturing the main horror aesthetic the show wants to portray when it isn't busy with all its other shenanigans. And it gets a 4 for anticipation, losing a point because it doesn't stand out from the rest of the soundtrack. As a standalone track, I could probably find quite a few things to study from it, but I wouldn't spend much time listening to it without reason, so it gets a 2. Gokukoku no Brynhildr's opening is pretty catchy, though I don't know that I would necessarily jam or hum along to it, so it gets a 4. Prior to making this video, I had a bit of trouble remembering how the actual melody went, though I can't get it out of my head now that I've been reminded, so I'll give it a 3 in that aspect. Considering how little I actually remember about the show, I'm just going to go ahead and give it a 3 and say that it fit the show to a middling degree. It definitely got me hyped for every episode, so 5 for that, and as a standalone track, I could see myself listening to it every now and then, though I haven't in quite some time, so let's go with a 4. Akatsuki no Yona's opening has a super clear, catchy melody to latch onto, and I haven't forgotten it once since I first heard it, so double 5s. It completely fits and sets the tone of the series, so another 5. It's incredibly hype and was one of the reasons I looked forward to watching every episode, and I listened to it at least once a month, so 2 more 5s. Yes, I'm biased and gave this one a perfect score, fight me. I realize this isn't every single instrumental anime opening, but I wanted to highlight 4 distinctly different pieces for a handful of different shows. Mentioning Great Pretender or Michiko and Hachin just felt kind of redundant when Baccano was already here with an instrumental OP that was the same style. And I still haven't seen Trigun or a lot of other shows that have instrumental openings, so I didn't feel right trying to explain how those fit the show that they were written for since I basically knew nothing about the shows. I mean, not that that stopped me from doing Gokukoku no Brynhildr, but at the very least I know that I have seen that one, whereas something like Trigun, I would just have no idea. Anyway, what are your guys' thoughts on instrumental anime openings? Do you think they have as much stock in them on the show as a whole, or am I just letting my bias show because I'm not a songwriter? Let me know down in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Opening themes also tend to get copyright claimed when I make a video on them, so if you enjoy analyses like these, consider going over to my Patreon and supporting me there so I can keep on making more videos like this. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.